This is Tony Arend, and I want to welcome everybody to SFS Online and On Topic. This webinar series brings distinguished members of the Georgetown faculty and alumni community to talk about the most critical issues of the day. It is produced by the Georgetown University Alumni Association in collaboration with the Walsh School of Foreign Service. And Professor Lotrionte and I will introduce her in just a second, are joining you from the campus of Georgetown University. We are sitting here on the 6th floor of the Intercultural Center. Those are real books behind us, and we're excited to be back on campus. The topic for today's webinar is cybersecurity and the future of the world order. A kind of a small topic that we're taking up today, but we're really honored to have with us a dear friend, a double alumna of Georgetown University, Professor Catherine Lotrionte. Professor Catherine Lotrionte did her undergrad at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, another institution. She graduated summa cum laude. She went on to get a law degree from NYU Law School. She ultimately came to Georgetown, where she got a master's from our security studies program and a PhD from the Department of Government, and we are sitting physically in the Department of Government right now. She's had a distinguished career in law and policy. She was an assistant general counsel at the Central Intelligence Agency. She served as counsel to the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. She has regularly taught here at Georgetown University. This semester, she is teaching an undergraduate course on intelligence law, and in the spring, she will be teaching an international law course also to a large group of undergrads. Among her many accomplishments is that she has been the impresario for a major conference that we do on cyber engagement, with all those events being held here in Gaston Hall. So it's an honor to present my friend and colleague, Professor Lotrionte. And I guess I want to start off, when we think of the world today, we think of all the international conflicts that are taking place. Obviously, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the things that are taking place there, war crimes, horrific actions. We see China challenging the world in various places, the South China Sea and elsewhere. We see North Korea launching ballistic missiles and potentially testing its nuclear weapons facility. We see Iran threatening. We see all these things going on in what we might call the kinetic world, meaning the physical world that we're used to in conflict. But there's a whole other layer underlying all this, and that's what might be called the cyber world. To our viewers out there of this webinar, maybe talk a little bit about what cyber is, what the cyber world entails, how cyber actions happen, and perhaps what some of the largest threats are.
So you're right to point out we're in the middle of quite a few different conflicts, right? And growing conflicts developing, and that is not anything that's changed. How cyber is played into it, I guess the best way to think about it, and when I teach the subject, is the way that the US government has also approached it, as the cyber is kind of an additional domain, right? So it's a new arena in which states and individuals will act and carry out their international relations between states in this domain, similar to how they do in other domains. So in terms of, particularly when we're looking at conflict between nation states, the cyber domain has just kind of been added, if you will, to air, land, sea, space. Right, so now you have cyber, and the Department of Defense has actually called it the cyber domain. So it certainly has been recognized by the US military, other militaries, as a domain in which conflict can take place. Maybe I think the early thinkers on the topic of how cyber would be utilized in times of conflict particularly might have been a little bit off the mark. And then I think the earliest people writing and thinking about it had envisioned, if you will, a lot more activity done in cyber separate from the kinetic space, that it would be kind of a complete when we talk about cyber war,
Mm-hmm.
that it would be somehow conducted fully in, through the internet and not at all in contact with the land or sea or air. What the reality has been different than that. We have seen that domain play a role within these traditional kinetic conflicts, but not as standalone. And so far, there is not, even including Russia-Ukraine conflict, we haven't seen any deaths as a result of a cyber attack, which some people had speculated also, that we would have these catastrophic, if you will, equivalent to Pearl Harbor kind of cyber attacks.
There were references to a cyber Pearl Harbor, as a matter of fact.
Many
yes.
people, I think maybe the first U.S. government official, I know Secretary Panetta had referred to that. Others had at some point. So I think original early on projections might have been a little off, at least to date. We haven't seen that happen. But we have seen the cyber operations take place within that context, going back as far back as I think the mark where we saw it in a conflict was Georgia, Russia, where the initiation it's first started with websites of Georgian banks, government websites being taken down, and then it rolled into a kinetic conflict.
Invasion, right?
Yes.
So that was like preface the invasions.
Yes.
You took down the banks, you had a cyber action,
Yeah.
and then you started to see tanks and various other things rolling in.
Yes. Yeah.
Let's mention historically. So let's talk about some sort of cyber actions that we might be familiar with to set the scene. And I do want to talk a little bit about the future of cyber and where it's going and the threat that it reflects and how it connects to legal rules as well. But one of the most notable cyber actions was the Stuxnet worm. Mm-hmm. Can you describe what happened in Stuxnet and how that sort of reflects a cyber operation?
So there were, and this was a report, and it was published by Sanger,
Mm-hmm.
David Sanger,
in the New York Times.
And then he wrote a book called Olympic Games.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the title of the book. The operation, so it's reported, it's not confirmed by any government. So in some respects, we could say it's speculation, but we talk about this in class. It is a great hypothetical because there's enough facts now that are out to the public. Whether everything is accurate or true is almost irrelevant, but to analyze it, I mean, what we do know, there are some things that can be called facts. What was that? And there's a time frame, about 2010. So there are things that predated this, but why Stuxnet in that particular operation is kind of sets the precedent, if you will, was that it was the first time that in terms of the history of cyber operations, that if anyone doubted the potential physical impact from a cyber operation, this event cleared that doubt up. So it was kind of the first of its kind in the sense that it was a cyber operation that had a kinetic effect. So a little bit about the facts that we do know. It was a cyber operation targeting the Iranian uranium enrichment program at one particular location. This was in Iran, at the Natanz facility. And it was the result of the cyber operation was that it resulted in the malfunctioning. The estimates are about 1,000 of these centrifuges, which are an important part of the process for enrichment of the uranium. It caused them to fail to function properly. They were not operating at a very precise speed, which is necessary. And they were taken offline because they were malfunctioning. So the estimates in terms of the impact to the Iranians' nuclear program was the impact, the result of this cyber operation, which caused the malfunctioning of the centrifuges, was that their program was delayed, right? Put back,
set it back,
yes. Handful of years. So didn't end the program, but that certainly delayed it. So what was reported in the press, and is to the extent that's all I know, was that it was a complex operation in the sense that there were what's called 0-day pieces of malware that were used.
And what do we mean by
code.
0 day? That's
So code was written, piece of malware which is based on computer code, which can do a lot of things. Malware was to make something not operate as it was intended to. When there are 0 day, it means that these were pieces of malware that had never been seen before. So if you have vulnerabilities because a new piece of malware has been put out there on the internet, that's what you'll typically hear from Microsoft and other entities, that there's patches for them. But if it's something that has never been seen before,
no patches.
Yeah, so these are rare in that typically they've been out, they've been used, and we patch for those, right? So now nobody's compromised with these. So it takes a lot. The computer scientists that examined the code and first found the code, there were a number of conclusions by all the experts that looked at it. That one, it was complex. That the level of complexity led them to believe that this couldn't have been an individual actor, and most likely it had to have been a sophisticated state actor who developed this code. So the conclusion that some drew from it, and David Sanger in his book, that there were 2 states actually working to get together and developing the code, deploying it. And I have no knowledge as to whether it's accurate. Neither government has kind of confirmed this or talked about it. Israel and the United States, and that's what David Sanger was writing about. And so, and the target was an arguably illegal nuclear program that the Iranians were developing at this facility. So that's kind of the way that it was deployed, as far as the public reports are, was that someone had physical access to the plant, and they were able to take a USB,
so flash drive,
and insert it into the network that actually controlled the centrifuges. And by doing that, that's how they actually compromised and made the centrifuges run at a speed that made them kind of overheat and steam and fail to work properly. So it was a physical access that was required because arguably this system was not on the internet, right? So
air gapped, or whatever they would call that. So that's fascinating. That's fascinating just to note. You know, we think about a cyber action as I'm sitting here, there's a computer in front of us. So me sitting here doing something in my office, and lo and behold, something happens elsewhere. But in this case, they took security measures to make sure that there was no external access, but somehow somebody got a flash drive that had the Stuxnet worm on it, and that Stuxnet worm on that flash drive somehow got introduced into the Iranian nuclear facility, which then caused the centrifuges to malfunction and fail.
You had to know, and some of the reasoning behind conclusions about it being state actors who put this together, aside from the complexity of the code itself and the fact that there were multiple 0 days. So typically not the average hacker has a 0 day, right? It's usually states, governments who have a lot of money, hire people, hire expertise that develop these, right? Now they are for sale in the dark web, but to have multiple 0 days, but also it was because in order to develop this code targeting this specific system, you had to know quite a lot about the software that was being used and the kind of system that the centrifuges were running on. So like they were based on like the Siemens kind of hardware, right? And so
German
yeah. So who would know that? So that
people inside.
Yeah, and likely intelligence agencies. Right. So there had to have been quite a lot of information and a lot of work, research and efforts, maybe years of work put on beforehand, not just developing the code, but knowing a lot about the target itself in order to compromise the target and make it malfunction.
So I just think that's a fascinating story, and we always tell it to our students to illustrate, in that particular case, how a cyber action really can cause physical effects, can, in this case, set back the nuclear program that Iran was in the process of moving forward on. So it's a good example. Have you noticed have there been some other recent cyber actions or cyber events maybe equivalent to Stuxnet recently?
So, I mean, you can point out, I wouldn't say to the that was a unique case and probably unprecedented, right? Because the reason why, because it opens the door now that it also states, if you are thinking these are states acting against states, states were now going to be willing to weaponize malware and target another government's official, arguably illegal under international rules, but official government programs and official facilities. So that's another reason why it was kind of unprecedented. To the extent we've seen cyber operations used by states, since then. Most of it, the majority still is what was happening before Stuxnet, espionage operations, so collection operations, using malware to infiltrate network systems, including classified systems of other states in order to steal information. So that continues. That is the majority of the activity. But in terms of physical destruction, we haven't seen it to the extent that we saw at Stuxnet, although there are other cases, including with Russian activities. But surprisingly, with the most recent Russia-Ukraine, I think most people, and I won't say we're disappointed, because who wants to be excited about seeing like cyber attacks, but most people who had anticipated large cyber attacks within conflict, we're not seeing that in terms of Russia and Ukraine. I mean, so of course, espionage is going to go on in conflict and running up to conflict in peacetime, and that still is between states. We are seeing what we've seen before in terms of doxing, where you're stealing documents, information, and then you're putting it out to the world. And
you can use that for blackmail purposes too.
Yeah, and that's going to continue. But I wouldn't say it's it for the. I think Stuxnet will remain, and maybe because it also was targeting a nuclear facility, kind of a unique and unprecedented at the time, and most would say potentially potentially concerning. And so there are a lot of debates as to whether it was justified or legal or not, whether this was a good move and kind of what precedent it set for states to kind of think this is now a free game to kind of do this.
And that makes sense. One thing that was recent but is different is the attack against the Colonial Pipeline. How do we conceptualize that? How do we think of that?
Well, and here's how you can think about it: is it's similar. It certainly has physical effect. So there's no doubt anymore that you can develop code, and if it's sophisticated enough, you can even damage the hardest targets, right? That there's likely no target that's completely air-gapped, so you can find ways to target. So even a company as sophisticated who puts a lot of money into their security, that's in charge of like pipelines, right? They're vulnerable. We have seen, so there was some years ago, Saudi Aramco was also targeted. So there are particular sectors like gas, oil, like pipelines, where if you want to disrupt a country's economy, everyday life, targeting their gas and oil distribution clearly is kind of be one of your high priority targets. So I guess Colonial Pipeline, it's in the sense, it has physical impact, right? And consequences, not to the extent people die, but it does kind of wreak havoc in, like it did in the United States, right? Long lines at gas lines. One clear lesson, if you will, from these very kind of high profile cases is that nobody is free from vulnerability, right? Whether you're a major corporation, whether you're a sophisticated government, a department or agency, U.S. government agency being targeted, right? Or particularly if you're a small company, you're all vulnerable. And so that has made it clear, and that is why cybersecurity is now kind of top on the list in terms of everyone's mind, even like corporate America. Boards of directors of companies that have nothing to do with cybersecurity need to be keenly aware and have expertise advising their board of directors, as whether you're Walmart, any kind of company, but particularly those sectors that a nation relies on, what Homeland Security would call their critical infrastructure, our banking, our electric grid, gas and oil pipelines,
dams, water
Yeah.
filtration facilities,
Yeah.
things like that.
that they're all vulnerable and therefore critically important to have attention, standards, regulations to make sure the cybersecurity is up to par with what you would expect their physical security to be, like nuclear power plants. And then
One thing we've seen, and I guess I would have to go back to when George W. Bush was president and Tom Ridge was the Secretary of Homeland Security, is we've seen more of a focus on cybersecurity. Maybe, tell the viewers out there what the U.S. government has been doing for the past, say, 20 some years in this area.
Yeah. So I would say if you go back in time, kind of the beginning in terms of, it might not have been a topic for the general public to be aware of or talking about regularly, but in 1997, it began. There was a game, or if you will, kind of
like a simulation.
Yeah, it was kind of physical. It wasn't kind of like on computers.
Like
there was a
tabletop,
physical. Yeah, it was called Eligible Receiver, and it was run kind of the organization of how this was going to be run was around the White House.
So this was under the Clinton administration, latter days of Clinton administration.
And the idea was, number of years earlier, I think one of the first agencies, the National Security Agency, was keenly aware, as well as they should have been, because their job as an intelligence organization, they held a lot of information on computers, right? As computer, you're sticking now data in terms of sensitive data as well, of course, on more secure computers. They were keenly aware about the vulnerability of not only the data itself of the computers being compromised, right, and data being stolen. And so the U.S. government was already thinking about how do we secure our own systems. In 1997, the Eligible Receiver project was to kind of game that out on U.S. government entities. So not everyone was told what was going on. And so, so people were told by the government, okay, you're going to be the bad guys and you're going to hack in, you have permission to try to hack into U.S. government
facilities, right.
And they were able to. So big lesson coming out of that is we are not secure or secure enough. So that's 1997. That's when the U.S. government, and you do have a number of important directives coming out of the White House under Clinton that start taking the protection of computers, our databases, our systems, and our information very seriously. So they start early on, start thinking about and getting organized. But then, fast forward through the 1998, we have events taking place, the high-profile events like the Estonia, Russia. Right. Again, so it's not a kinetic war, but it's a political disagreement about the location of a bronze statue in the capital of Tallinn. It was going to be moved by the Estonians. And what we have is a cyber operation targeting Estonia, mainly taking down banks. So
from Russia, presumably.
Yeah, they could track it back to Russia, taking down banks. Estonia, one of the most, maybe not today, but maybe still most wired countries in the world. So they do everything online, vote, pay taxes, get government benefits, banking. And so banks, people couldn't do their banking. I mean, no money was stolen, but people couldn't get to the websites of the bank, government websites, not operable. It didn't end up in a physical war. But then right after that was the Georgia-Russia. And so so the United States now sees the vulnerability of our own systems, right? And we have, during this time, of course, this is before DHS is set up, we are trying to get organized, and it's mainly the intelligence community who have the largest secrets to protect, our national security information. They're securing themselves. But in the meantime, the civil agencies are also vulnerable, but they're not the national security ones, right? Department of Agriculture.
Right.
Department of OPM, as we know it. So that takes a little more time though, and we have the OPM hack,
right?
Which then, so every time there is an incident, a compromise, whether it's a government agency like OPM, a U.S. company, the Google Google over in China. This is when Secretary Clinton was Secretary of State. So the response is everyone realizes everyone is vulnerable. And now sometimes the government reacts by new laws, new regulation, new oversight. DHS is created, and then DHS is going to be the main US government entity that's going to work with the private sector and ensure that our civilian government agencies are also up to par when it comes to cybersecurity.
And so this happens really under Ridge to start
With
it
DHS.
off with DHS.
Yeah. And the first secretary of DHS.
Yeah, first secretary of DHS, and becomes one of their main responsibilities.
Yeah.
I feel like there's much more of a general awareness on cyber issues, certainly than there was at the very outset of things. Where do you see things going? And I'm really asking this in terms of conflict and security. So here the question is really, I think your observation about the Ukraine war is very interesting, because if you would have asked me in February 1st of 2021, when it was clear that Russia was doing various things and our intelligence agencies were getting the information, and we were actually releasing information on that, if you would have asked me, I would have said that Russia is probably going to launch a major cyber operation, which is going to take place before any kind of actual invasion. And at least as far as we know, that didn't happen.
Yeah, so it's funny. And people, so first of all, no one, if they say it, I won't believe them. I don't think anyone knows for sure,
right?
Unless you're literally Putin,
right?
And potentially, and in that room making those decisions as to why we haven't seen what some thought would happen. So you're not alone in kind of thinking, oh, I'm probably going to see this. One, it's never bad to kind of war game things or do scenarios and expect the worst. And if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. It is important though to think, okay, what do we learn from it not happening? And what we have seen though, so a lot of people were surprised that we weren't seeing, whether it's the Pearl Harbor or something like it. And nobody has the exact answer as to why yet. There's debate as to whether they're following some kind of rule book about what they believe is within the bounds. Now, some say, well, no, I don't think they're.
Well, they're not in that with respect to the actual
That's right.
use of force there.
Are they thinking about cyber differently though? Are they saying, well, you know, in this space, we're willing to do X, Y, and Z, but cyber, we're gonna operate under a different set of rules, maybe, or, and some people say that's probably not what they think. It could be that they're kind of waiting to use it only when they must and want to, right? There is some speculation is that we don't know what we don't know yet, right? That maybe there has been something.
And maybe it's been countered. I mean, presumably something happened and some of it was countered, yes.
And so there is always going to be that. I do have a sense that if there was a big something already, we probably would have known something.
Right.
So there hasn't been that big event that some people thought would happen. But what a lot of the analysts, when they've looked and studied a country, so they're an expert on Russia or China, and when they've then looked at how that country has incorporated cyber operations into their government, and particularly into their military operations. It is interesting, the conclusions of different experts looking at the same thing is that what they've seen is that cyber is not treated as something standalone and special, but that they fit it into their same MO. So if a country is going to act in a certain way and has in the past, they're not going to change the whole way they think about the laws of armed conflict or conflict initiation they're going to just use cyber to supplement that. They're not going to kind of redo. So they'll follow the same MO. And it is interesting. So if we think about particularly the Russians bringing that up and think about our presidential election, the MO is not different than what they would have sought to achieve previously, causing disruption in our domestic trust in our democracy or our presidency or our elections, sowing discord, right, is not new. So they've just used cyber, and maybe it makes this more effective at a bigger scale because you're doing it through cyberspace, maybe more visible, but it is the same MO. Their target is the same. And so that's why I don't think we have all the answers about the in conflict itself. Why not pull out the big guns if you have them? So some have wondered and raised the question as to, have we overestimated the capability of Russia in the cyber domain?
Well, we certainly overestimated their capability in the kinetic domain, frankly,
Yes.
in this particular
So
case.
if we have, then maybe they were never able to carry out that big cyber attack initiating kinetic conflict. Others have said, no, they should have, we're pretty sure they're pretty sophisticated. But then again, we have overestimated them in other ways.
So that's fascinating. And again, to my question of sort of where the future lies, I think one insight that you mentioned is very noteworthy. And that is, it's not as though the cyber realm suddenly means that states will change their entire goal or in their entire MO, but that this will somehow be integrated into that.
So far, that's what we've seen.
Which would make sense.
Yeah.
Do you predict that we will see the same going forward?
I do, because just thinking about, well, one, most states have already gone down that road.
Mm-hmm.
To undo that would be a lot for any state to
Mm-hmm.
kind of, because it would require not just different strategic thinking, it's possible, but you're talking about organizations, right? Budgets, people, like a lot of money, right? Elected officials, right? There would have to be a lot of change. So I think just pure inertia, and there would have to be good reason to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I mean, I've thought about it. If it would be a case where a state has said, our very existence would depend on it, we need to now rethink this.
Sort of like we did with nuclear weapons.
Okay, yeah. If that were the case, yeah, we might see that. I'm not sure we would. I can't envision that actually how that would happen. That the very existence of a state would make it so that that state says, okay, now we're going to scrap everything and kind of do this. You also have to think about, is the technology advanced enough that you could kind of treat it as in and of itself separate, right? With all that would be required to kind of think, like in the nuclear, well,
right.
we had that.
Right.
We had, and it is different then, is that it was limited. Not everyone had that. Right. So it kind of gave the upper hand to some states. And so it made sense. We have the upper hand. Let's kind of rearrange ourselves and make a whole new strategy about this. But cyber, like, not every state might be as sophisticated in its technical capability, but they can get there. And it's not like you have to develop a nuclear weapon to get there.
Right. I mean, I could not build a nuclear weapon in my basement. However, I could learn enough to be able to do a cyber attack from my basement.
And they can, you can't, I mean, I'm not familiar with the dark web. It hasn't been part of my jobs, and I just haven't had a reason to become familiar with it in my research. But I don't think it is easy to kind of go online and buy a nuclear weapon. Now, I have read generally that, like, keep knowledge, know-how, maybe, but in terms of 0 days, you can, if you have the right amount of money, literally they are for sale.
Wow.
And so other countries, any government could start developing and buying and purchasing, and it was, aside from hiring their own people, kind of get this capability, right? And might it take them some time to be as good at doing, the developing the cyber themselves, but you could also hire and buy, purchase that.
Right. I guess with the right amount of money. With the right amount of money, it's still hard to get a nuclear weapon, for example, but you can get some really qualified hackers that can put together some code. Well, let's open it up to some questions here, and I'm going to put on my glasses because I am an old man. And do we have anybody that wishes to ask questions? Please write your questions in the question box, which is in your control panel. And I am not seeing any questions pop up. Please ask your questions. Now is your time. But I'm going to ask you another question as I await questions in the box. Aha, here is a question. Oh, this is interesting. So this is from Anne-Marie Simonelli, if I'm pronouncing that that right. We got 2 Italian Americans right here. Professor Lotrionte's family did not change their name. My grandfather, Antonino Cicotta, changed his name. But so, any comments on the soft power of the cyber world and how it might impact the kinetic world?
So maybe you can, in terms of soft power. So Joe Nye has written.
Who's a friend of Professor Lotrionte's.
He's up at Harvard. You know, we like
we don't,
both
yeah,
there,
but
it's not Georgetown. But yeah, he's written a lot about soft power in general, but also I think it's his last book or the one before that, in the cyber context as well. So if we take kind of that idea of soft power and the ability, and the importance of leveraging soft power, not just your traditional kind of military. I think just as the theory demonstrated the value of it, including what Professor Arend and I talk about, norms and rules, which some would say are part of that soft power, right? As well as your kind of cultural lifestyle and others. Certainly any domain, I don't think cyber is any different in terms of one, the relevance of it, the power that it has in terms of one, maybe convincing others to, like what we talk about, play within the rules, right? And I guess what Joe would talk about, Professor Nye would talk about, that it's not all about your military strength, right? And if you think only about that one aspect, one, you might be setting yourself up for some conflict that you might want to avoid, but also you're losing out at the power of that. And we talk about this in the context of law, of course, but diplomacy, you know, there are many classes here talk about the soft power of diplomacy itself. So in terms of one concrete example, for example, in the cyber domain, there are now cyber diplomats. I believe, I didn't realize I gotta check this out. Yeah. I believe the United States had the first cyber diplomat, and I believe, I believe it was Chris Painter.
Oh, it's friend of yours. Friend of yours, yeah.
It was, so when State Department created their coordinator for cyber at State Department and an office, and that position in running that office, still not an ambassador level position, but that was created, and I believe it was when Secretary Clinton was the secretary.
So in the Obama administration.
Yeah, I think so. We, the United States, the topic of cyber and cyber rules being negotiated, cyber norms among states was already being discussed at the UN in a number of capitals in different countries. But the US was the first to set up, he wasn't an ambassador, so he was called a cyber coordinator, but he did what a diplomat would do. He was working with his counterparts, and at that time, not many countries had an office, had a person that you could call. Now, many countries do. And there are, Heli, my friend from Estonia, was Estonia's cyber diplomat. And so now, I don't know what the number is up to right now, but there are cyber diplomats, and they meet at the UN, and they are in charge of negotiating and talking about cyber rules, cyber norms. And that is part of cyber soft power in the cyber world.
That makes a lot of sense. We got another question here, which is by John France, which I think is a good one, because you mentioned Estonia, and you were also very close to Tuomas Ilves, who was the president of Estonia, who really helped build up their cyber stuff. So Estonia, they're voting online all the time. And so John asks, well, if we can bank securely, and that's how I do my banking, why can't we vote, say, in this country online? Or, I mean, aside from the politics, is it something that would be possible from a security perspective, or would there just be too many challenges in a country like this?
So I don't know. There's not my area of expertise, but I'll explain what I know so far. One, in terms of a country like Estonia, Estonia is small.
Yes.
The size of the United States makes it much more complex. Not only that, how our elections are run, who is in charge of running the different elections, right? In terms of the states versus the federal government, right, is complex. So getting everybody on the same page, and I think we saw some of that, not in the cyber realm, But when the federal government, so cybersecurity, for instance, they were not voting electrically, but when we were concerned about the election, the security of the boxes, right? The federal government Department of Homeland Security was saying to the state election officials, let us come down to your state and help you make sure your ballot boxes are secure, right? When you're putting it,
right.
And state election officials
didn't want
yeah. Like, no, you're not going to come down here and touch our ballot boxes. So there are complexities that I can't even appreciate the extent of them. I'm giving you one example. It probably goes beyond that. So I think the size of the country, the way that our laws and authorities are for state officials, federal government. So the federal government, of course, has more resources, money, people to dedicate to the problem, but how that interacts with the state officials who run the elections, right? I think makes it complex. So it's not as easy as let's get good cybersecurity on all these systems. I also don't believe that there is ever something called 100% secure.
Right.
So it then all depends on how much money and resources are you going to put into the security, and how willing are you to make a bet that it's secure enough. So in the banks, you're right, probably the banks have the best record in terms of their security. Banks have spent millions of dollars on their security for good reason, right? And yet there still are problems with our credit cards, right? But banks are kind of what they say is that right now, I think it's good, they're not holding the victim responsible if someone gets hold of your credit card number and uses it or steals something or from your bank account. The banks are covering you, I believe, up to a certain amount, right? I don't know of any larger amounts what they would cover you. But so voting, though, I think key to our country as a democracy, I think that's a much bigger step. Even if we could fix the state federal issue,
but that's a big issue. That's a big issue.
We might not ever be able to get over that. But I think even conceptually, I don't know if as a culture we're ready to be comfortable and feel secure. Like just think about the election 2016, what havoc and that, some people say, well, if it was online it'd be better. What we don't know, right? Well, we're not sure, but that was very disruptive. So our elections can cause this country to be kind of torn apart if we have controversy over the validity, if you will. And so there might be too many questions with the voting online that would, maybe people are just overly concerned or just concerned rightly that there's questions about the validity of all the votes electronically provided. We might not have the president in place when we need him.
And it raises an interesting issue because many states have gone back to paper ballots. So when I first voted, it was for McKinley. No, it wasn't quite that long ago. When I first voted, it was in Maryland, and you actually had a machine, and it was all machine tabulated. There was no ballot at all. Now, when I vote in the District of Columbia, there's paper ballot. You do stick it into a machine, but at some point, if they wanted to tabulate it, there's a piece of paper that they can compare to it as well. Patty de la Puente, who is a former student and is also a great alumni leader, asks about the elections coming up, and I'm going to play a little bit with her question because you responded to some of it, but let me ask this question. Do you anticipate any kind of state or non-state actor interference in the elections of, well, we got elections coming up next month, but in particular, the presidential election of 2024?
So, one, I have no inside information about this. I would,
you're not in the hacking group from Russia. That's
correct.
Okay.
And I'm not in the U.S. government anymore, right? So I have no kind of, what I would hope and expect is that the people who would know the exact answer to that would be in our intelligence agencies. I'm certain that our intelligence agencies, having learned from the past, are watching for that. And they would have seen any telltale signs. Maybe I'm wrong, but from understanding the government and kind of how I expect that's what they've been watching, and they would know if there's a possibility. Now, I do think, though, that if there was, as we approach the presidential election closer, if you start seeing official statements by like Secretary of DHS, just publicly giving a speech, and in that speech, there is a subtle or not so subtle warning made to any other states to don't think about messing with the election, that would tell you a couple things. One, they would not say that unless there was grounds
Right.
to believe that something is in the mix. That and they probably will not call out a state unless there is a reason that there's already controversy and they need to call out the state. It may be a generic, general, but to have that said by any state official, that would be an indication that our government knows something, can't and won't talk about to the public details, but is sending a warning. And that is what happened. That is what happened running up to the presidential election. It happened even after it, when we went through it, and then we had other midterm elections. There were warnings put out officially, publicly. If you see that, then something's going on that we might not see, and they're trying to. But what was interesting is, did those warnings work? Most people think, well, we didn't see that extent again. Now, two things could happen. Sure, no. Either they backed off, or we got better
at the security.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't care which way it was. In fact, I'm just happy that we could have some kind of resolve and peace and feel more comfortable with, okay, we had midterm election, we're okay with our election. We're not as kind of, it's not ripping this country apart the way it was. So it would be great if we had better security and wouldn't have to worry about this. I think we would ultimately have to continue to worry about it, because adversaries, I think now that this is a rich field, they've seen the potential of this kind of operation to disrupt a country like the United States. I can guarantee, and this is, I have no inside knowledge, but I am sure adversaries, all adversaries, have now got this on their little playbook. Like, this is a worthwhile operation. And so if it's on their playbook, adversaries then will come up with new and more sophisticated ways. So you fix a hole, a vulnerability, secure it.
They find another.
Yes. So I think this is going to be an ongoing thing. I don't think they will all of a sudden say, oh yeah, it worked for the Russians and there was no major problem for the Russians after that, but we're not going to try it. No, I think if adversaries being adversaries, they're going to say it's in our book. So I think it'll be, but that hopefully is an ongoing problem for our security agencies, and they then dedicate their resources to making sure they track and keep up with the most sophisticated adversaries, the new vulnerabilities, and keep patching and keep up with the security, right? So hopefully that's going on behind what we don't have to be concerned about at this moment. That will continue to go on.
Let us hope so. And we are actually out of time. I want to thank everybody out there for joining us. A big round of applause for Professor Lotrionte for joining us here live in the office. It's a great pleasure. I want to thank Kelly Young from the Georgetown University Alumni Association for producing all this behind the scenes. And I want to thank Eleanor Monty Jones, whose idea this was to have SFS online and on topic. I wish you all a great day, and we will see you soon at our next webinar.